I'm a PhD candidate working on assessing PFAS leaching from soils. Welcome, Dr. Silverman, to our seminar speaker series. Um, we have a lot of students, grad students, postdocs, and professors in this seminar series, and the goal is to develop professional to train young professionals to get enthusiastic about the whole waste management field and stuff. And there have been a lot of speakers in the past sharing their experience, their career, and stuff. So let me introduce Dr. Silverman to everybody first before we get started. And please, if anyone has questions, you can save to the end of the speech, or you can leave it in the chat. And please mute yourself through the presentation. So Dr. Silverman is Director of the Office of Environmental Protection and ESNH Reporting within the Department of Energy's Office of Environment, Health, Safety, and Security. Dr. Silverman leads an innovative organization focused on reducing DOE's environmental footprint and preparing it for the impacts of a changing environment. His portfolio includes programs covering environmental compliance, sustainable operations, and natural and cultural resource protection. He is also engaged in public and environmental radiation protection, organizational and safety culture, and reporting and analysis of a wide range of ESNH metrics. His significant accomplishments include helping DOE sites eliminate millions of metric tons of CO2e by cutting releases of sulfur hexafluoride, the world's most potent greenhouse gas, creating a new green purchasing awards program to incentivize adoption of sustainable products and services, playing a leading role in the global green electronics movement, and working to integrate changing environmental factors into DOE's operational risk planning processes. In 2013, Dr. Silverman was a finalist in the Partnership for Public Service prestigious Service to America Medal Awards program, and his work on SF6 reduction was profiled in the New York Times and Washington Post. In 2015, he was recognized with the Purchaser Leadership Award from the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council for creating DOE's Green Buy program. He received a Champion Award from the Green Electronics Council for successful efforts to heal fractured coagulation of stakeholders, and was part of a Climate Champion Team Award recognized by the White House Green Gov Awards program. Dr. Silverman joined DOE in 2000 after receiving his PhD in History and Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. His dissertation, No Immediate Risk, Environmental Safety in American Nuclear Weapons Production, examines how DOE managed environment, safety, and health risk from World War II through the end of the Cold War. He helped establish a new program to compensate nuclear weapons plant workers for occupational illnesses before moving into the environmental and sustainability area. Welcome, Dr. Silverman, and thank you for coming, and please give your presentation.
Well, thank you. You kind of went through a whole lot of, elements there, and it's an interesting time to be speaking. I was approached last calendar year for this, and I'm glad to talk, and I hope there are aspects of my journey that are helpful. I want to be upfront that a lot has changed over the last few weeks, and so the bio that I shared is probably not one that I'm going to continue to leave on the department's website, although I've not yet updated it. It's still available if you look me up on DOE's website, and I'm very proud of all the work that I've done in that regard. But I guess I'm just going to preface what I'm going to say with a couple of things. One is, I frankly haven't had much time to actually prepare a formal presentation for you all, in part because there are a lot of fire drills and some actual fires that we're dealing with now as leaders in the federal sector at the moment. And so I'm certainly prepared to, talk through kind of my background and how I wound up doing what I'm doing, and um, touch on some of the things that you mentioned, PFAS, sulfur hexafluoride, risk in DOE operations over time, which I think is a understudied topic, and highly relevant to the work that all of you do. But to the extent that this is an early career forum, I don't know that in normal times, I've never been sure that my path is one that's particularly instructive for anyone else, although it's obviously there's always things you can learn from folks. In the current environment, I'm particularly not sure of that. So we'll just see where this goes. I also want to just update that in addition to being the director of the Office of Environmental Protection and Environment Safety and Health Reporting, which has been my job for the last 8 years, I have now for the last 5 days also been the director of DOE's Office of Health and Safety. So I pretty much have the entire corporate environment safety and health portfolio that doesn't fall into the category of nuclear safety at the moment. And that's entirely the result of the departure of a significant percentage of the department's personnel over the last week, and the need for people who are still here to take on more portfolio. But I've got even a kind of a greater, perspective on risk and risk management within DOE now coming through my portfolio than before. I came to the department 25 years ago. I finished up my dissertation at Carnegie Mellon, and I'd sort of stumbled into a project that became really fascinating to me, which is good because you're going to do a dissertation on something, you better be excited about it. And but it's really a study of changing perceptions of acceptable risk over time, focused on nuclear weapons production. And, we started building nuclear weapons in World War II, at the point at which we are fighting a hot war on two fronts and are terrified about the potential of Nazi Germany having access to some sort of new form of superweapon. So the decisions that were made in World War II about what constitutes acceptable risk are going to be fundamentally different than decisions that are made about acceptable risk, either even before the war started or after the war. And of course, the decisions made about acceptable risk in the 40s and 50s look very different to us from later years, and so I basically tracked through a couple of case studies decisions about what constituted acceptable risk from the World War II era to the end of the Cold War. It's an interesting series of discussions. We started off in World War II building the world's first operating nuclear reactor, in the city of Chicago, right, in a squash court under the football field at the University of Chicago, not the place that you would want to scale up a brand new technology with the potential for, runaway, reaction possibilities. But they did it, and they did it without incident, and they ran it for 5 minutes and never ran it again. And then we wound up building the actual production reactors out at the Hanford site, and that's a site that's chosen specifically for safety reasons, that there were hardly any people living out there. And so if things did go south or boom, there would be, the damage would be relatively less than if it was in the second most populous city in the nation at the time, Chicago, or even in the outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee, which was a major industrial manufacturing center for the war effort. And they didn't want to risk Oak Ridge having facilities that could take Knoxville offline, which, as they conceived of the risk of the Hanford production reactors and separation activities, that was a possibility. So even the location of these facilities itself does represent a fairly substantial and I think well considered for the time risk assessment, risk management practice. Um, and the interesting thing about the operations at the Hanford site is they were relatively safer than many of the other things that people might have been doing during World War II. In the security enterprise, and the consideration of certainly worker protection was something that was surprisingly, at least to me when I got started, I was impressed with the degree of care that appeared to be taken in terms of worker protection, particularly from radiation as a hazard. Now, radiation was an unusual hazard. It was different, and they knew it was different. And of course, they'd been, a lot of experience working with radiation over the last, frankly, 40, 50 years. And they'd learned a lot from the radium dial painters. They'd learned a lot from other sort of, industrial and initial medical applications, and, both mainstream and quack, if you will. So they had some understanding of the dangers associated with radiation. They really wanted to protect the workers, in part because workers were in short supply. They're a critical resource, and particularly workers that were trained and skilled needed to be protected so they could continue to do the essential functions. Um, and so when you look at worker safety, even during World War II, and then certainly during the early years of the Atomic Energy Commission, which took over the weapons complex after the war, you actually find in general that worker safety protections are relatively robust. And one of my case studies for my dissertation focused on worker protection at the Fernald plant, which is a uranium processing facility located outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. And that was a kind of full spectrum uranium processing facility. That is, it could receive raw uranium ore on one end and then pump out finished metal ingots or slugs or uranium hexafluoride gas on the other end. So they did the sampling and analysis. They did the initial refining of the ore into some sort of metal or forms that could then be worked into actual usable form. So it's a full service, sampling, refining, and then metal fabrication and chemical fabrication facility. Um, Again, when it opened in the 1950s, it was comparatively cleaner and safer, I would argue, than any other industrial facility in the Ohio River Valley. You know, that the monitoring of the workforce, both with dosimetry badges and with the urinalysis and any other bio monitoring that they were doing at the time, meant they were really tracking, whether and where people were getting exposed. And they were also really focused on capturing and controlling the dusts that were generated through the process. And that, of course, was a primary industrial hazard, is to be through the dust inhalation. Because uranium was in such short supply that they wanted to capture those dusts. They wanted to reintroduce them into the front end of the processing cycle so they could capture those. So, both the national security needs, in a sense, also helped support robust worker protection activities. Fernald was cleaner and safer when it was built in the 1950s, but one of the key stories of the nuclear weapons production system is that because of the nature of the Atomic Energy Act and security restrictions that protected all of the production facilities, they were then not subject to the regulatory changes that affected the rest of American manufacturing starting in the 1970s. So again, the Fernald plant and most of the DOE nuclear weapons production system is built in the 40s and 50s. The U.S. in the 1960s engages in a pretty robust social and political conversation about environmental protection and occupational safety and health that results in 1970 with the passage of major legislation and new agencies focused on environmental protection and occupational safety and health. So in 1970, OSHA and EPA appear on the scene and begin to really bring a patchwork of environmental and worker protection efforts that had been, different in every state, and to create a national system and much more robust than had existed previously. But what would become by the end of the 70s the Department of Energy, the nuclear weapons production system was shielded from all of that because the Atomic Energy Act prevented OSHA and EPA from having any insight into or oversight over the operations at DOE facilities. Um, uh, that was concurrent with a substantial decline in the production efforts within this weapons system. If you look at the kind of the arc of the Cold War, we obviously are go during World War II. If you all saw Oppenheimer, you get a sense of the, just the intensity of the effort that went on there. And, at the end of the war, one of the dirty little secrets was we really hardly had any fissile material left to build additional atomic weapons. And if nuclear weapons were going to be America's kind of, guarantee of its, international might and peace across the globe, well, we needed to be able to build more of those things. So the weapons complex never shut down. And retooled after World War II. It really continued to operate at a pretty high level. And of course, the tensions of the Cold War started even before the Hot War ended. So we were already involved in a Cold War with the Soviet Union in 1945. As the war in Germany came to an end, the Iron Curtain went up, and that conflict began. And then in 1949, after the Soviets detonated their first atomic weapon, well, the arms race was on. And it was go through the 50s, so that we went from having literally probably enough material for one, maybe two additional devices after the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to having a couple of dozen in the arsenal in the later 1940s, to having tens of thousands in the arsenal by 1960. So if you look at the curve, it just kind of goes, and but after the mid 1960s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the emergence of what Kissinger called détente, where the U.S. and the Soviet Union realized we really don't like each other, but we're not actually going to blow each other up. That's not in either of our self-interests. The pressure to produce more fissile material and more weapons for the stockpile leveled off and then tailed dramatically. So in the 1970s, if you look at Fernald, its production had been sky high, or peaking throughout the 1950s, but then it went down, and it was at a very low level through the 1970s. When Ronald Reagan took over in 1981, he wanted to expand the nuclear stockpile. He was reanimating the tensions with the Soviet Union, which itself was perfectly happy to reanimate those tensions. So there was the efforts to develop new missile types and to increase production capacity. And the Fernald plant, I'm telling you all this because the Fernald plant really had declined. It had not been maintained. It hadn't been invested in. And so as it attempted to increase production, it also began to increase emissions. And the difference between the 1950s and the 1980s, when it was increasing emissions, is that the EPA was on the scene. And even though they weren't inside the plant, they were monitoring the rivers. They were monitoring downwind and downstream. And so at Fernald and at, frankly, every DOE site, external groups began to get more and more indications that things weren't right inside the fence line. So even though they weren't able to get in, they learned that there were things that weren't going on right. And Fernald was one of the places where kind of the lid blew off, and not literally, thankfully, but people realized, oh my God, they're polluting neighboring groundwater. They're polluting people's wells. People are drinking their drinking water is contaminated with uranium and trichloroethylene coming from the plant, and that really unleashed a whole process where, it's on the cover, front page of the Cincinnati Enquirer, over and over and over again as the exposés keep coming out and the information keeps coming to light, ultimately landing them on the cover of Time magazine and the subject of many, GAO investigations and congressional reviews, et cetera, et cetera. That led to finally the Energy Department being officially subject to environmental oversight, and to have to create a much more robust safety and health, worker safety and health framework. So all that's a very interesting story, and I did my dissertation on that. And then I stumbled into a job at DOE because we were trying to set up, or the department had finally acknowledged in 1999 that some workers, yes, were actually made sick from exposure to radiation and other toxic contaminants in the nuclear weapons workplace. And I want to emphasize to you that up until 1999, the department formally fought pretty much every worker compensation claim from somebody who developed a radiation-related cancer or chronic beryllium disease or silicosis or asbestosis or any other illness that might have been related to working in environment with some of the most hazardous materials known to man. The thing that changed that was actually beryllium. Beryllium is it's a interesting element. It is lighter than aluminum. It's stronger than steel. It's actually more expensive than gold, and it has really unique properties in terms of its tensile strength and reflectivity that make it particularly useful in nuclear weapons design. And so as we started to see clusters of beryllium disease around DOE sites, it became undeniable that that exposure was actually related to DOE occupational environments. When people were turning up with asbestos-related lung disease, well, asbestos is used everywhere, right? So you could have gotten that any number of places. You couldn't accuse DOE of being the location of that. But when it's beryllium disease, because of the specialized nature of this material and its rarity in any sort of operational industrial environment, it was the beryllium disease that made it clear that workers were being made sick by DOE activities. And the assistant secretary and secretary at the time were able to then leverage that to say, and we know through epidemiologic research that there's also radiogenic cancers that are occurring, and then also asbestos and other environmental occupational toxins. They leveraged that to create a new occupational illness program, the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Act in 2000. So I was hired in 2000 initially to help make the case and support the argument that such a compensation scheme was needed. And then after it passed, I then spent the next half dozen years helping to get the program established and worked up. And that was fascinating because I was a historian. I was applying for academic jobs, and it was really a shock, not just to myself, but pretty much everybody in my program and field, that I got a job like bringing my files into DOE headquarters and almost immediately answering questions for the secretary and the assistant secretary, and this expose that USA Today ran because nobody knew anything about, and I'm like, oh, I have the data on that. Here's what happened in this case. So it was kind of a heady and again unusual circumstance. It was not to get the French Revolution is fascinating, but there aren't many, applications for it. So historians don't typically get hired in this way. But I happened to pick a topic, and have the good fortune to have the opportunity to apply this. So I did that for a while, and then and that was a fascinating opportunity. Then I moved into the environmental policy world and started looking at how chemicals were used at DOE. And at the point at which we started looking at greenhouse gases, I helped to try and develop the first comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory for the Department of Energy. And of course, most of the greenhouse gas inventory is comprised of fossil fuels combusted for energy use. That's what how most greenhouse gases are generated. But some fraction of them are generated through chemicals. And so we were looking at how DOE used chemicals. And what we found was that the department was an extremely large user of sulfur hexafluoride, which is the world's most potent greenhouse gas. It's 22,000 times more potent a greenhouse gas than CO2. It's just incredibly effective as a global warming agent, and DOE was using this without really focusing on having to contain this material, because it was not a health hazard. It wasn't regulated in any way. So you could just use it and release it and not worry about it. And so we were able to we were able to identify where those uses were, and we actually found a lot of low-cost ways to cut down on how those releases happened, and that we made some significant headway there. Had, I think, a really positive impact, and we got some nice recognition from that as well. I kind of stayed, I guess, associated with fluorinated materials, because then I got into PFAS. Then later in the 2010s, first learned how to spell PFAS probably in the 2018 timeframe, and realized that it was becoming a big problem around Department of Defense sites with their use of firefighting foams, the AFFF, aqueous film forming foams, and that can just uncontrolled release to the environment, and then showing up again in groundwater, drinking water. So we were concerned that potentially DOE had similar liabilities, because of course we use some AFFFs at DOE, and we, as I already noted, had a history of uncontrolled environmental releases affecting offsite populations. So I wound up leading DOE's efforts to try and understand its PFAS liabilities. And we put out our own PFAS roadmap. EPA had the lead, of course, for the entire federal sector, and they had a PFAS roadmap. But we did one for DOE, and it was really based on 4 pillars. One is just basically understand, what did we do with PFAS, and were there impacts? And then if we did, our second pillar was to manage those, to ensure that we were protecting our workforce, the public, the environment from any impacts. We also, as the owner of the nation's 17 national laboratories, thought we could potentially be part of the solution. We wanted to try and identify solutions. And indeed, national labs had already been involved in looking at different aspects of the PFAS problem. It wasn't a central focus for the department as a coherent effort, but we were kind of involved in different places in different ways. And so we wanted to get a handle on that. And we realized that of course, so that was our third pillar. And then our fourth pillar was to communicate and collaborate, because, we're not in this alone. This is not a DOE specific problem. But we also have learned over the years that it's important for us to take steps to try and maintain the public's trust, and make sure that we are kind of a credible actor and are engaging in a kind of a forthright way with the regulators, with our surrounding communities, with the tribes, where there's an interest in DOE operations, so they can have confidence that when they're talking with us, that we are sharing what we know and working to try and identify solutions to ensure those protection goals that we identified earlier. I think we've had very good success with that. I mean, on the one hand, it's helped that it turns out that our PFAS liabilities are not, they don't look like the Department of Defense's PFAS liabilities. In part, that's because of what I mentioned about how Hanford was cited. Our facilities are not located generally right next to large population centers. So even though we've used, and trained firefighters in the use of, firefighting foams, they aren't getting into people's groundwater, particularly quickly. So there are uses, there are releases, there are probably going to be some environmental liabilities that we have, but it's not at the scale. And so that's and we've been able to try and to demonstrate that. We're continuing to learn more, and again, we are committed to sharing that data and approaching the issues as we need to. But it also means that, in our engagement with the regulators, they're like, okay, we're not concerned about DOE. You guys are doing what you need to do to give us the confidence. And that does then release the regulatory burdens on the department, which allows our mission activities to continue then without that additional pressure. So, we do make the case that the environmental coordination that we do is actually aimed at helping to support the department's ability to accomplish its missions more effectively. Because when we do have the trust and effective working relationships with our regulators, with our key stakeholders, with our surrounding communities, then we're actually able to operate more effectively. And I think that's a lesson we had to learn the hard way back in the 80s and 90s after the issues at Fernald and again, the rest of the DOE complex became apparent. We've worked hard over the last 30 years to try and regain some measure of that trust. It's very difficult to regain. It's very easy to lose. And so we need to kind of commit on an ongoing basis to rebuilding that trust. So that's kind of the little bit of the nature of my journey of how I got to where I am. I hope that's of some interest to you all. And so I'll stop there and happy to take any questions or comments that folks have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Silverman. Uh, it's so interesting that you're a historian from the beginning and then get involved in all of these environmental policy, occupational health issues in the Department of Energy, because most of the students here are like engineers or scientists. So it's kind of interesting to put things into context of the work we are doing and to think about what it means to the society. So thank you so much for sharing all of the
Well,
experience and stuff.
you're welcome. And if I could just make a point on that. So, one thing about being a historian is I never have to claim to be a technical expert, but most of the topics that I just talked about, whether it's PFAS or sulfur hexafluoride or the potential occupational exposures in the workplace, they are multidisciplinary. There's generally not a single discipline that holds all the answers. And so what I had to learn to do from the beginning was learn how to talk to physicists and engineers and facility managers and environmental engineers about what they did and how those pieces fit together. So I've always been sort of a translator or a connector in order to kind of put together the story that at first I tried to tell in my dissertation, but then in terms of advancing these programs and policies, they were always interdisciplinary and interconnected. And so I don't pretend like I have the technical expertise, but I do have the capacity to talk to and understand, to it, to the first, couple levels, what's going on, at least enough to be able to understand maybe who else we need to bring into the conversation and whether it's going in the right direction or not. And I think
Yeah.
that's the skill that no matter where you're coming from, if you can recognize the limitations of what your expertise offers in that situation and work to make the connections with the other disciplines or even organizations that speak a different language than you professionally to try and identify how you can work together to solve a problem, then the possibilities for success increase dramatically on complex challenges.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. I guess we have a few questions. So Catherine, please.
Yes, thank you. That was a absolutely just wonderful talk. And I'm curious, a number of years ago, the Department of Energy led it was a retrospective study on um, effects. It was more like the ethical effects of scientific studies on members of the population,
The
not
human
the
radiation
workers.
experiments effort. Is that what you're
Yes,
referring to? Yeah.
yes. Were you involved in that effort
No,
as
I was a
well?
grad student at the time, and my advisor invited the head of that effort to Carnegie Mellon to talk to the grad students about what that effort was about. Because again, I came out of a history and policy program, so we always had an applied kind of viewpoint, and so uh, I think he focused on that in part because of my interests in this, but. So I did get to meet, the head of that effort. It wrapped up though before I finished, but the organization that I was hired into was part of that effort. Um,
Thank you.
and we still get questions from members of the public related to certain aspects. Some more interesting than others.
Thank you very much.
Bert.
Hello. I thought it was great that you were employed as like a historian, sort of like an institutional memory of the whole thing. So I think that's a great idea. Uh, I was wondering, what do you think the technical side, the technical people learned from you and your presence there? I know you said you provided like a connector, translator. What do you think they learned from your presence there?
So that's a great question, and you know it's not always clear to me, whether people learn from me or not. But I think a couple of things. One is, as I was just kind of going up the management chain in DOE, I had the opportunity to do a kind of a nuclear executive training, um, and during that training, somebody said something that was so, in my view, profoundly misinformed that I kind of slammed my hand on the table and said, "Wait a minute," and I went on a kind of a 10-minute diatribe about why they were mischaracterizing what the issue was, and that if they didn't understand, in this case, they were complaining about these anti-nuclear crazies who were protesting their efforts. And the person that he was labeling a crazy was somebody whose drinking water had been contaminated by DOE and DOE had not told her, right? So
Hmm.
um, the understanding of the department's own history is something that I've brought to DOE to help technical
Hmm.
people understand that the work that they do and the decisions that they make about environmental protection or public health and safety have real world implications, and that people in positions like theirs in years past made decisions that cost the department a lot. It costs the American taxpayer about $8 billion a year, which is what goes to the Office of Environmental Management to clean up the mess we've made since World War II in building nuclear weapons. It also costs an additional, we've already paid out about 25 billion through the Energy Employees Compensation Act that I mentioned, and that continues to be paid out, a billion or more a year through that.
Hmm.
So the technical decisions that people make about how DOE designs, builds, operates, manages its facilities have real world implications. And the public never knows as much technically as you know about the work that you're doing. But if you aren't able to take the public's concerns seriously and communicate with them effectively about what you're doing, then you put the department at risk over the long term.
Okay. Well, the question might not have been fair in hindsight. They would know what they learned from you, but maybe I asked it like, what do you think was important that they learned from you? And I think that was a great answer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions from the audience? Please, Steve.
Hello. Hi, Dr. Silverman. Thank you for talking with us today. So you mentioned that you worked on this project where you found that like sulfur hexafluoride, but I believe was a very potent greenhouse gas that the DOE was releasing in some way. Was that through like a nuclear area that the sulfur hexafluoride appeared, or was it like a different aspect of DOE, or where did, I guess, what was the context that
Yeah.
that chemical came up in?
So, sulfur hexafluoride is primarily used in an industrial setting as an electrical insulator in high voltage equipment. It's incredibly stable. So it like yeah. So yeah, electric utilities use it in transformers, switch gear, and so in that for the electric utility industry they use a small amount of SF6 in a large number of pieces of equipment. That each transformer has a couple of pounds of SF6 in it, and that leaks over time, or it can be lost during transfer activities. And so we have some of that at DOE. We've got plenty of high voltage equipment, of course. But what we found was that sulfur hexafluoride was also used inside a lot of the high energy physics equipment. So if you're trying to detect, subatomic particles in an accelerator, if that accelerator is actually conditioned with sulfur hexafluoride, that reduces electrical noise and arcing and sparking in the, in the physics equipment. And so here at DOE, we have a relatively small number of pieces of equipment that have tons and tons of SF6 in the chambers to, in effect, increase the detection capability within those chambers. So one of the ways that we were able to dramatically cut SF6 emissions was to ensure that the recapture devices that had already usually been designed into the systems were actually connected, were actually people were incentivized to use them, and then were maintained and monitored and maintained so that they would work effectively. The interesting thing was we found out one of my observations, and this is not any formal finding, but the some of the programs that were really well funded didn't worry about recapturing their SF6 because they always had money to buy more of it. So it was just as simple for them to vent it to the atmosphere than it was to actually make sure that the reclamation system was operational. But the relatively lower dollar, less well-funded accelerator programs did a much better job of recapturing the SF6 because they couldn't afford to replenish the supply as often. So we knew it was feasible to do it. We knew it was relatively cheap to do it, and we saw dramatic reductions in SF6 releases through relatively, I mean, there were no capital expenses needed. It was really a matter of fixing the policies and getting people to pay attention to what had to happen. We also looked at the, routine use that looked like the utilities, because we then have a lot of switch yards and switch gear at DOE sites. And so getting into the preventive maintenance and leak detection and repair is also something that we incentivized all around. But the heavy hitters, the immediate kind of, getting, 50% reductions was primarily focused on stopping the silly stuff, if you will, the things where there were really high winds quickly. We've continued to work over the last 15 years to try and continue to improve on the margins, but we probably got a 50% reduction in the first 2 years, and then we've probably gotten another 10% reduction over the next dozen years, is how that's worked. But if we don't maintain that diligence, we can easily see those emissions start to go up again.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Irene, please.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. That was incredible. I love history, so this is such a joy. I was wondering, so I'm a current PhD student, and my dad's actually a historian, so I grew up hearing all these historical stories and being always warned, like, if you forget history, you're destined to repeat it. It's like a very famous, quote.
Mm-hmm.
But something I'm been struggling with trying to incorporate historical issues that the DOE and the DoD has had with different communities is how do you actively incorporate history into science while also trying to do these like cutting edge science things that are trying to move into the future. There's like that delicate balance, and I was wondering if you had any advice from the historian side of like what you'd like to see from scientists and engineers when it comes to contextualizing history in their work.
Wow, that's a wonderful question. So I guess the first thing I would say is please think of the life cycle of what you're working on. We tend to be very present focused and, oh, I can accomplish this thing, in this way. But what are you creating as a result of that? And how are we going to deal with that over the long haul? What is the enduring legacy of what you're doing? Not just because you've, identified a new, you've advanced the science this much, but, is there a waste product? Is there a downstream or downwind consequence, either physical or, kind of sociocultural, and what might the implications of that be? Because everything we do, there's a footprint associated with that, and what does that footprint represent? I have interesting philosophical discussions sometimes with our national laboratories because every new innovation, and we see this now with computing, and we've been seeing it with computing for forever, but for decades. But now, when we're talking about artificial intelligence or exascale computing, the amount of energy that's needed just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing, and there's sort of no stop. And so one of the questions is, at what point is are the gains not worth the costs? And those are fair questions to ask. The other way to integrate this is to, there is a a robust history of science. That's a very robust field and lots of interesting things that are done there. And I think kind of recognizing and celebrating the activities, but not just looking at history from a celebratory perspective, but kind of, again, having a clear-eyed view of, oh, we've done this, but we've also, caused this. And how do we figure out, as we continue to advance in our scientific and technical fields, how we can accentuate the positive impacts of the work that we do, but be clear-eyed about the legacies that have been created before us and avoid contributing more negative legacies going forward. I think that, again, that's an ongoing challenge that we all face, and I think is maybe one way to help get some perspective on your question. Hope that helps.
Thank you. That was a wonderful answer and really helpful.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, I have a question myself. It's a more practical question. So I'm working on a project that is funded by DoD, to assess PFAS leaching from contaminated soils. And I was looking at DOE's website on their action on PFAS and like the roadmap and strategic roadmap and stuff. And this project is like until 2025, right? Like the roadmap is from 2022 to 2025, and now it's the last year of it. So I was wondering how much they have achieved, since I've not been following on PFAS work from DOE a lot since I'm working for DOD.
Right.
And also, what do you expect that will happen on the PFAS side for DOE, maybe starting from next year to 2016, if you have any opinions? Thank you.
Sure. Always it's plenty to talk about with PFAS, no doubt. And I am the agency lead for PFAS coordination. So again, historian, right? I am not the I'm about coordinating with PFAS, and that's both because of the way DOE is structured. Our actual PFAS liabilities are at our actual operating facilities that are managed by our line programs, the Office of Environmental Management or the National Nuclear Security Administration, or Office of Science. And I'm in a corporate ES&H function. So I need to bring people together to figure out how we deal with this most effectively. We developed a roadmap in part, as a limited time frame, just so we could identify deliverables and what could we do. We didn't want to create a separate kind of regulatory process. We knew that EPA was working on a regulatory approach, so we are really looking. And initially, we did some things. Like we put in a waste disposal, PFAS disposal moratorium, because we were frankly not satisfied with the science around the efficacy of different disposal and destruction methodologies that were used. And we wanted to, and some of the practices that our sites were looking to follow. So we really wanted to be sure that we weren't creating new liabilities for the department. And so we put in place a disposal moratorium. We've now lifted that moratorium because EPA has updated its guidance on destruction and disposal of PFAS containing materials. And feel like we now have a more robust regulatory framework. It's still nascent, and it may be changing direction now, but there is much more of a framework. And so it's not, I don't know that it's essential for DOE to have its own roadmap anymore, because we always had wanted to make sure we were in alignment with what our regulators would be concerned about. When we started looking at this, though, before there was a regulatory framework, and we wanted to make sure that we were not impacting people's drinking water, that we weren't having effects that we knew would need to be addressed, even if there wasn't yet a regulatory framework to address them. So having answered that question, that it doesn't appear that we can now shift to making sure that we're compliant with the regulatory frameworks that have been promulgated and are continuing to be promulgated. So, and I'm really looking for the opportunity to have a discussion with the new administration, the leadership that we have at the department, about what their vision for kind of PFAS related work will be. It's something, when I started working on PFAS in the first Trump administration, it is part of a commitment to clean air and clean water that they've, talked about. But what does that need to look like? I want to see as we go forward do we need to have the same level of coordination? We might not, because we've actually answered some of the initial questions we had. But in terms of the role of the national labs, and the ways that we help to contribute solutions, there may be things that they'd like to see us do more of. So that's a conversation I look forward to having.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. And I guess PFOA and PFOS, those two chemicals being like circular hazardous substances, will also affect how it will move forward. Since
Right, so that's where
many
DOE sites are CERCLA sites, and many others are RCRA. And so we're seeing that the regulatory framework is coming together, and it's now just for those two, and then there's more in the drinking water component, but that's the what we can see emerging.
Okay, thank you. I think one last question for the general audience, like a lot of people here are like early career researchers. So any last minute recommendation, like for whether they're in grad school or they're job hunting, especially now, any like recommendation or suggestion, insights?
Yeah, so I would have had a very different answer a month ago than I do now. But I think that risk and risk-informed decision-making will continue to be vitally important. And in fact, there may be newly emerging areas where we need to, ask really good questions and bring the best kind of science and analysis to bear because things are happening where, as I talked about, wanting to understand the downstream and downwind implications of your actions. I think a lot of actions are being taken where we have not taken the steps to fully understand their implications. That concerns me on a number of levels. And I think we are going to need people with the skills and the knowledge and the capabilities of this group to help us address those challenges. I'm not entirely sure what the job market for that will look like right now, but I know the need will be there. And I encourage you to look for ways to leverage those skills and those insights that you will be able to bring to bear to help us make sure that we are managing these risks and liabilities in the most effective and protective ways possible.
Thank you. This is really helpful. We just continue to do what we are good at. I think that's very important. Thank you so much, Dr. Silverman, for joining our speaker series and to give us such a good speech and a lot of good suggestion and answering a lot of questions. Thank you for taking the time to join us. I hope you have a great afternoon. I hope everybody stay tuned for our speaker series. See you next time.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.